At the beginning of the Gospel of John, we read, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. What came to be through him was life, and this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." And then just a few verses later, after giving a brief account of John the Baptist and his work of preparing the way of the Lord, John says, "And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And we saw his glory. The glory is of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth." The Word was made flesh. This is John's way of speaking about the Incarnation, which is the event of God's Son, the eternal Word of the Father, at a point in time in our human history, taking on human nature and becoming man. In the Incarnation, the Son of God, co-eternal with the Father and the Spirit, humbled himself to share in our humanity and became like us in all things but sin. This is one of the central truths of Christianity, the belief that God was so committed to being in covenant relationship with us that he took on our human nature in order to draw us back to himself. Now, of course, there are a number of questions we could ask about this, and in a later video, we'll break open some of those questions. But today I want to look at the question of why. Why was the Word made flesh? Why did God choose to save us in this way? When St. Thomas Aquinas considered this question, he asked, was it necessary that the Word become flesh? And his answer was no. Strictly speaking, it wasn't necessary. God could have saved us any way he wanted to. But he says, practically speaking, it was necessary because it was most fitting. What did he mean by this? Well, you can imagine God thinking to himself, how can I make myself most accessible to humanity? How can I reveal myself to them in a way that they will really understand? I got it. I'll become like one of them. You can imagine God thinking, what was the best way for us as human beings to experience God's own divine self? By God assuming the very humanity through which we experience everything else. The incarnation of the Son of God was most fitting because it was truly the best way for human beings to encounter the eternal God. You see, Jesus is God's truest self on display. As St. Paul says, Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the very imprint of his being. In Jesus Christ, God becomes knowable and accessible in an unprecedented way. This is the beauty and the mystery of the Incarnation. In the Incarnation, the eternal Son of God has become one like us and has made his dwelling among us. But why? What was God ultimately trying to achieve in the Incarnation? Well, we know that from the very beginning, after our relationship with God was ruptured by sin, God set a plan in motion to draw us back to himself. And this plan, which passes through Abraham and Moses and David and the prophets, culminates in the life and mission of Jesus, who came to do 4 things. 1, the Word was made flesh to save us by reconciling us to God. God made us for life and union with him. But through sin and disobedience, we've fallen out of right relationship with God and lost our ability to experience eternal life. The problem with sin isn't that it makes God love us less. The problem with sin is that it's bad for us. It wounds us and prevents us from experiencing the life and love for which we were created. But as St. Paul says, through Jesus, God was reconciling the world to himself. To reconcile literally means to bring back together again, or even more literally, to make friends again. God sent his Son into the world in order to heal the wounds of sin and division and restore in us our ability to experience union and friendship with God. This, at its core, is what salvation is all about, a restoration of our relationship with God. 2, Jesus came to reveal God's love. God sent his Son into the world to demonstrate once and for all just how committed he was to our good. Jesus shows us that there is no distance that God isn't willing to travel in order to bring us back into union with himself. Or as St. Paul says, that nothing will separate us from the love of God. In Jesus Christ, God's love becomes incarnate. As St. John says, in this way the love of God was revealed to us. God sent his only Son into the world so that we might have life through him. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him might not perish but might have eternal life. God is love, and he has created us by love and for love. And in Jesus Christ, he proves his love and his willingness to take on our weak and fallen humanity in order to restore us to life. 3, Jesus came to be our model of holiness. God's will for us has always been that we bear his image and likeness in our love for him and each other. Just as any parent rejoices in seeing their children grow up to be kind, honest, and generous people, God's desire is for us to grow in holiness. But God doesn't just tell us to be holy. He shows us what holiness looks like. Through the life of Jesus, we see the humble, self-giving, sacrificial love of God on full display. And we are called to follow his example and model our life on that way of holiness. After getting on his knees to wash the feet of the disciples, Jesus says, "I have given you a model to follow, so that as I have done for you, you should also do." This is our model of holiness, to love and to serve. Jesus not only shows us the way, he is the way. To live in holiness is to love like Jesus. And 4, the Word was made flesh to make us partakers of the divine nature. Jesus, the eternal Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, chose to empty himself and become like us in our humanity so that he might elevate us to share in his divinity. As St. Irenaeus put it, the Son of God became a son of man so that we might become sons and daughters of God. By uniting himself to our humanity, God enables us to become one with him in his divinity, to become adopted children of God and share in God's eternal life. Jesus didn't just come to save us from hell, he came to give us access to life in the fullest, to share with us the fullness of life and love and goodness which is God himself. Jesus humbled himself to share in our humanity so that through union with him, we might come to share in his divinity. This is the fullness of salvation, to enter into the life and love of the Trinity. These 4 reasons for the Incarnation are worth remembering. Try to memorize them if you can, because I think this is a helpful lens through which to read the Gospels. As you look at the life and ministry of Jesus, ask yourselves how you see these 4 reasons for the Incarnation on display. And know that by uniting us to himself in the Incarnation, not only has God given us new life, he has called us to be co-workers with him in bringing that life to others. Let us never forget that we have a God who loves us, a God who never ceases to draw near to us, a God who has set before us a path that leads to life, love, and happiness. By the help of God's grace, let us remain on this path always. Thank you, and God bless you.